have to share on screen once again. So in Parshas Emor, the Torah tells us, we shouldn't desecrate God's name. Rather, we should sanctify God's name amongst the Jewish people. So this is the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, mitzvah 296 in the Sefer Chinuch. So let's see what the Sefer Chinuch says on it, and then we'll take it to a broader appeal. So it says the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, so the mitzvah of sanctifying Hashem's name. We are commanded, instructed to sanctify God's name, as it says, I shall be sanctified, says God, amongst the Jewish people. Koloma, which means to say, that we have to be prepared to actually be Moshe Nefesh, to give up our lives, chas v'shalom, if necessary, in order to fulfill the mitzvahs of our religion. We've already explained, so our sages have already explained, according to tradition and according to textual support, which mitzvahs we are required to give up our life for rather than transgress. And the immediate question you can ask is, well, hold on a second, the Torah tells us you should keep my mitzvahs and live by them, which we explain, which is live by them, meaning don't die by them. Meaning, if you find yourself in a situation where your life is in danger, you can transgress even Shabbos, in Kashrus, all mitzvahs in order to preserve life. So how can we now say that in order to sanctify God's name, we have to be willing to give up our life? The mashmas is same v'chai b'hem, you shall live by them. The mashmas shelo yamas b'hem, which implies that we mustn't die by them. So keeping mitzvahs shouldn't be a reason, a source for us to die. The truth is, when it said you shall live by them, that wasn't talking about for every mitzvah, every matter, or every avera. We live according to tradition, meaning our understanding of anything in Torah is based on the traditions that we have that explain it. So our sages explained in Gemara and Sanhedrin, that there are three, which we call the cardinal mitzvahs or sins, which a person, they should be killed rather than transgress. Meaning, if somebody forces you to commit one of these averas, you have to give up your life rather than transgress them. Veheim, and they are avodah zarah, idolatry, v'chol avidara, and all the things that go with it. Koloma, kol inin shalah. Anything connected, any of the negative prohibitions connected with idolatry, if we were forced to commit them, we would have to give up our life rather than do so. As we'll explain later, hopefully. Similarly, adultery, immorality, and finally, murder. So we've got idolatry, adultery, and murder. So if someone was to say to you, put a gun to your head, and say, worship idols or I will kill you, we have to be killed rather than worship them. Even if the person who's been forced to do so, it still maintains their complete faith and their fear of God. So therefore, they're doing it completely unwillingly. The truth, nevertheless, a person can't say that. Well, I'm still, better that I do it, but I still remain in my faith. No, it's better. We are required to give up our lives rather than do this negative, this wicked thing. In order that we don't give any opportunity for the person forcing us to do this to be able to think that actually we have gone against one of the fundamental principles of Judaism. Urosh Sifra and the Midrash says, so we'll see from the context, the Torah will say, you should sanctify the Jewish people. I am God who took you out of Israel. So he's asking, what's the connection between God taking us out of Egypt and us as sanctifying his name? The whole reason I took you out of Egypt is in order that you can sanctify my name. Similarly, the other two that we've mentioned, person would have to give up their life rather than transgress. So we see that the basic definition of Kiddush Hashem is the requirement to give up our life rather than transgress these three cardinal sins. We see it a bit further. It says, Shorish mitzvah, the essence or the source of this mitzvah, Yadu, it's well known, Ki Adam lo nivarak la'avod boro. The whole purpose of us being created is in order to serve our God. Now, the definition of a good servant is somebody who be willing to do anything for their master, to the extent where they'd be willing to give up their lives for them. A person who wouldn't, a servant who doesn't do that is not a good servant. And therefore, we have to, under circumstances, be willing to forgo our lives for our master. How much more so for our master, the King of Kings, God Himself. So interestingly, the way the Sefer HaChinuch frames it is that if an Eved, if a true faithful servant would be willing, or the definition of a good servant is one who's willing to go to the extent of giving up their life for their master, then how much more so should we, who were created in order to serve our Creator, the God Himself, for us to be good servants, we also have to be willing to go to that extent. And although he doesn't quote it, we'll see the Rambam will quote it, there's a pasuk in Isaiah who says, Hashem says to him, Avdi Ata Yisrael, you are my servant Israel, Asher B'cha Es Pa'ah, through whom I will be glorified. The ultimate accolade for a Jew is to be called an Eved Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu was called Eved Hashem, the servant of God. That to be able to say, the idea obviously of being a servant is not a particularly attractive one. Clearly, nowadays, or at all, has very negative connotations with being subjugated and being mistreated. But when the Torah talks about being an Eved Hashem, remember, we became God's servants when we stopped being Pharaoh's servants. Yeah, remember with the final plague in Egypt, I think we mentioned this a couple of times ago, that for the first 9 plagues, the Jewish people didn't have to do anything in order to be safe from the plague. They weren't struck by it, the Egyptians were. But when it came to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, God says, you've got to take the lamb, slaughter it, put your blood on the doorpost. I will pass over it, and the angel of death will not affect you. Commentators ask, why particularly with the final plague, the Jewish people have to do this, do something to protect themselves? The answer is that the final stage of us leaving the servitude of Pharaoh and becoming God's servants, going from Avdei Pharaoh, servants to Pharaoh, and becoming Avdei Hashem, servants of the God, is you have to do an act of service. What makes somebody into a servant? Again, think back to when we went to restaurants, yeah? What makes somebody your waiter or your server? An act of service. When they serve you something, that makes them a servant or a waiter, or whatever the word it is. But it's through an act of service. So for us to become God's servants, we have to do an act of service. And the ultimate act of service is the willingness or the acceptance that sometimes it's required to even give up our lives in the service of God. There's the ultimate accolade to die al Kiddush Hashem. And the Gemara talks about these famous sages who were living in a time where even Torah study was forbidden. In fact, if we look at more of the sources, Halakha goes into it, that if you a person living in a situation where any of Jewish observance is forbidden on pain of death, then the person would have to give up their life rather than transgress even the most minor thing. And that's what we saw, those martyrs that we see in the Gemara, were willing to give up their lives because they were forced not allowed to keep the Torah. Okay, so we see that's the broadest understanding of Kiddush Hashem, the narrowest understanding of Kiddush Hashem, that we have to be willing to give up our lives in order to not to transgress 3 cardinal sins. And the rationale behind it is that we are God's servants. Now, I want to take it a little bit, broaden it out a little bit, and see that it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. the Kiddush Hashem doesn't have to be that you give up your life if you're being forced to do an Aveira, transgression. You can also find positive ways to make a Kiddush Hashem. Well, before we look at that, I just want to show you something really interesting. Because as I mentioned, it's in the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem is in the middle of last week's parsha of Parshas Emor. But it's always interesting to look at the context of where the mitzvah comes from to see something about it. So if we look, the first part of Parshas Emor is God's instructions to Moshe to instruct Aaron and his sons and the descendants of Aaron, the Kohanim, certain mitzvahs which are specific to them. So, for example, who they can marry, who they can't marry, the requirement to keep away from spiritual impurity by not being in contact with the dead, and many other things in relation to that. And then we move on to some of the sacrificial laws which are pertinent to them. The Torah says, Hashem says to Moshe, saying, so this is also in terms of sacrificial order, that when a sheep or goat is born, 7 days it shall remain with its mother, and on the 8th day it's acceptable to become a korban, an offering to God. The Shor says some here laws about you shouldn't offer an animal from a flock on the same day with its young, because it is when you sacrifice a thanksgiving offering to Hashem, you should sacrifice it so that it may be acceptable in your honor. On that day, you have to eat its meat. The person who brings the sacrifice eats the meat. You shall not leave any of it over into the morning. And you shall carefully keep my commandments. And do them, and do them because I am Hashem. And here is our mitzvah. You shall not transgress. You shall not desecrate my holy name. You shall sanctify me amongst the Jewish people. I am the God who sanctifies you. I'm the God who took you out of the land of Egypt. To be your God, I am Hashem. Okay, so we mentioned that idea before, that the reason why Hashem, the Sifri said, the reason why Hashem took us out of Egypt is in order that we have the opportunity and the duty to sanctify him. And then the Torah goes on. Next chapter, Hashem and Moshe anymore. Hashem says to Moshe, saying, speak to the Jewish people and say to them, these are my fixed times, the fixed times of Hashem. We should proclaim the sacred occasions. 6 days you should work. On the 7th day should be a day of rest. Mikra Kodesh, a holy day. You shouldn't do any work. Shabbos Hashem, it's a day of rest Hashem in all your dwelling places. These are the appointed seasons of Hashem, which you shall appoint in their season. And it goes on to say, by Chodesh Rishon, the first one is going to be Pesach, and it goes through listing all of the festivals and the sacrifices which are relevant to them. Now the question is, we've got the laws of sacrifices, the laws relating to the festivals and their sacrifices. Stuck in the middle is this mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. What's the relevance? What's the connection between what came before and what comes after with this mitzvah? Why is Kiddush Hashem seemingly just sort of plonked in the middle of two things which seem completely disconnected or unconnected to it? Now, I think the answer, if we look at this short quote from Misrach Eliyahu Dessler, who says that Kiddush Hashem is the most significant mitzvah in the Torah because it encompasses all of the Torah's other precepts. Its centrality in everything we do. Says Rav Dessler that we shouldn't look at Kiddush Hashem as actually one of, so it's mitzvah 296, that it's just one of 613 mitzvahs. In fact, it is the central, most significant mitzvah because it encompasses everything else. Meaning, if a person dedicates their life or is constantly conscious of the need to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, to sanctify God's name in this world, then everything else flows from that. If you know that your mission if we know that our mission in life is to sanctify God's name, make God's names holy, then we will do everything that we know we must do, and we will avoid everything we know we mustn't do. Yeah? if we know that we have such an important role, if a person knows that they are a Jewish prince or a Jewish princess, a prince and princess have to behave in a certain way. Every way, the whole way a prince and princess behave, and we see in the news very much nowadays the differences between those who how those in those positions behave. You see quite clearly, but that royalty know what's expected of them, and everything they do is dictated by that position, their status. If we were constantly aware of our status as B'nai Melech, as princes and princesses, then we would do everything that's the right thing, and we would avoid everything which is the wrong thing. I think what Dais is that's explaining, therefore, that's why you can plonk this mitzvah right in the middle of all other things which seem to be totally unconnected, about bringing offerings to the temple, about all the festivals, all of it, whatever it is, all mitzvahs, regardless of what they are predicated on this commitment to Kiddush Hashem. And Rabbeinu Yonah goes even further in Shara Teshuvah, and he says, in fact, the reason that Hashem selected the Jewish people, elevated them above the rest of the nations of the world, and sanctified them with his Torah mitzvahs, we say when we make a bracha before we do a mitzvah, we say, Asher Kiddishanu, that God, you have made us holy through giving us these mitzvahs. You sanctified us. You made us special and different. The reason why God did that is entirely so that they would sanctify his name. In other words, Kiddush Hashem is the raison d'etre of the Jewish people. Not only is it a mitzvah of great significance, it's the sum total of our mission on this world. You can't get any stronger statement than that. That if we need to stop someone, a Jew in the street, and say, why are you here in this world? We should really be able to answer in order to make a Kiddush Hashem. But we are here as God's witnesses in this world. You want to put it another way, a negative, not such a pleasant way, but Hitler, Yamach Shemo, he said, what was his issue with the Jewish people? He said, the Jews are the conscience of the world. That we represent a morality, we represent the fact that there's more in this world than just a physical existence. Some people find that very challenging, but nevertheless, we have to always maintain that focus. We can't, the danger is we get distracted, and we do get distracted. We're both physical and spiritual beings, and therefore we do get distracted by the physical aspects of our existence, and sometimes we forget that we're here on a spiritual mission. What is that mission? Ultimately, to make a Kiddush Hashem. What is it? Yeah? What is a Kiddush? What is making a Kiddush Hashem? Living a moral and an ethical life, something which brings nachas to God himself. Just as a parent, a parent only wants their children to bring, the only thing they want from their children is nachas. The one thing you can't buy, you can't go into a shop, you can't go into the butcher's, a kosher butcher, and say, I'll have a pound of nachas, please. You can't quantify it in money, you can't bottle it. It's like simcha. Yeah, these are things are spiritual things. They're quasi-physical spiritual. You try to explain nachas to somebody who doesn't know what nachas is. Yeah, you can't. Yeah, I'm not even sure the word pride is quite the right word. It's something deeper than that. It's felt within you. It's something that's it's so valuable that God himself wants nachas. Yeah, we say nachas ruach to the Torah, that we should bring nachas to God. Yeah, we are God's children. We say it again. I know I repeat this phrase so many times. It's so important to remember that. Banim atem esher, we say in Devarim. God says, "You are my children." God doesn't need anything from us, but the one thing we can give to him is to give him nachas. How does a child give nachas to their parents? By just behaving, by being a decent human being. That's the minimum or the maximum that a parent could ask of their child. But as God's children, we have a holy duty. We are tasked with this. This is what we have that's been entrusted to us. If a parent gives a child, something precious, they give them, something very valuable. All they ask of the child is look after it. Yeah. Just don't damage it. Don't lose it to start with, but don't damage it. We have been given a very precious task in this world. And God, all the God's asking us is don't lose it, don't damage it. This is your role. Yeah. And almost if you look at this context of it, it's saying this is more important to God than anything. It's more important than the sacrifices. It's more important than the festivals you keep. Yes, you still have to keep Shabbos and Kashrus. Yes, all things are important because they all lead to a Kiddush Hashem, and it would be natural. If a person is attuned to Kiddush Hashem, it would be natural to them. But that's got to be, it's got to be the starting point. It's got to be the central pillar from which everything else flows. You can't be someone who keeps Shabbos and Kashrus, it appears to be frum, but does things which actually cause shame. Yeah, makes a Chilul Hashem. Yeah, people who are dishonest in business, people who are rude. Yeah, and people give the Jewish people a bad name. That's the opposite of Kiddush Hashem. So although I said the extreme example of Kiddush Hashem is being willing to give up your life for it, you can now move on and actually say, we've seen the Rambam. The Rambam defines for us a more positive and more a realistic aspect of Kiddush Hashem, which is this. If a person has been scrupulous in his conduct, gentle in his conversation, pleasant toward his fellow creatures, affable in manner when receiving, not retorting even when affronted, but showing courtesy to all, even to those who treat him with disdain, conducting his business affairs with integrity, and doing more than his duty in all things while avoiding extremes and exaggerations, such a person has made a Kiddush Hashem. For a man who does all such things all their life, of him the verse says, and he said unto me, the Old English, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I may be glorified. That's the verse we saw up here in Isaiah. Yeah, Abdi Ata Yisrael, you are my servant, through whom I will be glorified. Yeah, so it's not just the commitment to give up our lives in order to avoid the three cardinal sins, but also basically in our daily conduct, how we interact not only with God, but almost more importantly with our fellow human beings. Do we behave in a decent way? And again, I think it's the best way to summarize this aspect of it is another Yiddish word, the word mensch. Yeah, to behave like a mensch. Again, it's not a word you can necessarily explain very easily, translate into English very easily, but we all know what it means. Like a mensch. We all know what it means. I want to share with you a beautiful story that I saw that I think explains this idea really beautifully. This is a story I saw written by Rabbi Shachar Front. It's a very well-known rabbi. He has a lot of Torah tapes he does on every Torah portion. The story is about Torah Stoles involves someone called Harold Wilner, a member of the Baltimore community, illustrating how it's possible to make a Kiddush Hashem in the most unlikely of circumstances. Harold was flying from Boston to Vermont. As is required nowadays, Harold would move his shoes and put them in the container that goes through the metal detector. He then experienced the nightmare that everyone prays won't happen. Someone else at the under end of the conveyor belt mistakenly took his shoes. Harold did find a pair of shoes at the other end of the side of the conveyor belt, but the person who left them, those shoes was a size 7, and Mr. Wilner couldn't fit into size 7 shoes. Now, he was trying to catch a plane to Vermont without any shoes, so he called over a security agent, who in turn called the head of security at the airport. They offered Harold a voucher for a new pair of shoes, but he didn't have time to look for new shoes, otherwise he would have missed his flight. Now, a woman who was also in the same queue observed all that had happened, and she saw a man with a suit and tie and no shoes. So she told Harold that she felt very sorry for him, and that she had a pair of slippers in her carry-on which she offered to give to him. She took out a pair of pink slippers that were made to be worn with the slippers, I think it's the word thong rather than tom, thong separating the big toe and the other toes of the foot. Harold had no choice. He took the slippers, proceeded to walk through the airport with his suit, tie, kippah, and pink thong slippers. Imagine the sight. That day, the plane had to be boarded by climbing up a set of portable steps. Harold's luck was that the slippers fell off his feet while ascending the staircase and fell to the ground. He had to go back down the stairs, put the slippers back on before climbing up them again. Harold finally arrived at his seat on the plane, feeling exasperated by his experience. Another passenger, who'd witnessed the whole scene from beginning to end, said to Harold, "I'm amazed that throughout the whole ordeal, you never lost your cool. You never became angry. You never raised your voice. You acted with such civility that it astounds me. It's a credit to your religion." Says our friend, come and see. Someone could be wearing a suit and tie and pink slippers, and at that very moment, sanctify the name of God by acting like a mensch. People can be so uncivil, losing their temper, becoming abusive at the slightest occurrence, such that proper and appropriate behavior on our part stands out and makes a powerful impression, about which it can be said, and then he quotes again, sorry, I'll cut it off, but again, that verse. He said unto them, "You're my servant Israel, in whom I shall be glorified." So again, a cute little story, but a really good example of, just people see how you behave, right? People look to the way Jews behave, and we're faced with these choices all the time. Do we? Again, this Mr. Wilner had perfect excuse to get annoyed, even maybe to get a bit angry, to shout, whatever, but he didn't. And in that, he probably, even without thinking about it, he was able to make the Kiddush Hashem. So again, we come back to the beginning. It doesn't need to be that extreme. The ultimate Kiddush Hashem is being willing, accepting that we have to give up our lives rather than transgress the three cardinal sins. But we can make a Kiddush Hashem in our everyday lives just by living as decent human beings, treating each other with respect, doing what's right, and everything else flows from that. And then there's, as we saw, that therefore that makes Kiddush Hashem the most significant mitzvah because everything revolves around that. That's the basis for everything. From Kiddush Hashem, a commitment to Kiddush Hashem, everything else flows and everything else falls into place. Okay, I'll leave it there. Any observations, thoughts on that?
Just that if the whole raison d'etre of Jewish people is to sanctify God's name, and that is a known thing, for want of a better word, was there really a need for a specific mitzvah stating it?
That's a good point. Well, it's similar to the idea of Kedoshim to you. The Torah says that you should be holy, and there's a lot of discussion. Well, and what does that mean? So some commentators mean, well, that means avoiding things which are forbidden. Others say no, that's obvious because those things are taught which are forbidden. Others say, well, it's avoiding those things which are permitted to us, but acting. The famous teaching by the Ramban Nachmanides, which is you could be a nivel b'shus HaTorah, that a person could be a degenerate person, but do everything completely kosher. A person could eat kosher and do everything right in all other aspects of their life, but still be not a particularly nice person, because they act in a way which is not particularly delicate or tasteful. But they're not doing anything, they're not actually transgressing any mitzvahs per se, but they're not taking it to the next level. So Kedoshim to you is almost like a catch-all mitzvah. So in any situation where you're not sure, is this the right thing to do? Is this not the right thing to do? Kedoshim to you says, well, what is holy? What is the holy way to behave? Similarly, the Torah says, you should do what is right and proper in God's eyes. Now, again, we should know what's right and proper in God's eyes because He's given us 613 mitzvahs. He's told us what we can do, what we can't do. Why then say you should do what is right and proper? Because, the commentators say, because we will find ourselves in situations which aren't necessarily governed by a specific mitzvah or avera. You'll find yourselves in certain life situations where you can't think, oh yeah, I know exactly what I'm meant to do here. Therefore, you need the general principles in the back of your mind, which is, although there's no specifically right or wrong thing to do here, I need to discern what would God want from me. Again, like a parent to a child, a parent can say to a child, do this and do that, and don't do this and don't do that. Don't cross the road without looking. Don't speak to strangers. Wear a coat. You eat 3 meals a day. Wash your hands before. Yeah, they can tell them all the specifics. But as a child matures, they also need to know the general principles, which are, look after yourself, be a decent human being, speak nicely. Yeah, because the child will find themselves in a situation where there won't be a specific directive that the parents given them, which will govern what they should do at that very given moment. Therefore, they need to know, what will my parent want from me? The Midrash tells us something fascinating about Yosef. Yosef HaTzadik, Yosef was called the righteous one, the only one in the Torah called the righteous one. How is he able to be righteous? And specifically, when Potiphar's wife was trying to seduce him, the Midrash says, how is he able to succumb? How is he able not to succumb to her advances? The Midrash says he saw the image of his father through the window. Now, what does that mean? He was seeing he had those flashbacks or hallucinations? No, I think what it means is this: that he found himself in a situation he didn't know what to do, but he was able to summon up. He thought, perhaps, how would my father react if I was to do the wrong thing in this situation? And that was enough to keep him on the right path. And that's what we're talking about here. The Torah is saying, make my name holy. You find yourself in a situation you don't know what to do. Everyday situation, someone's rude to you, or you're in a bad mood and you just feel like you want to shout at somebody. There's no Torah mitzvah that says don't shout, don't be rude, don't react. Torah gives a general principle, which is always do the thing that's going to make a kiddush Hashem, and avoid that it's going to do the opposite. So that's why it has to be there as a generic mitzvah to as a catch-all for almost like the fail-safe for when we find ourselves in situations which aren't specifically governed by any other particular mitzvah. Does that answer the question?
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, otherwise we'll leave it there.